Good evening and welcome to Zion's Banner. We're continuing our adventures in Leviticus. Leviticus is a difficult book in the sense that there are a lot of details for a system that would seem almost barbaric. In fact, as I'm describing these things, I know that my friends not my friends, the folks at PETA, the group for the proper treatment of animals, would be absolutely horrified at what I'm going to be describing. And yet, God set this system up deliberately. Shout out to Samuel. I saw him last night. I'm thrilled to have him back here. And Slam RN, thank you for jumping in here. There are at least several different types of sacrifices that serve different purposes under God's instrument for relationship with Israel. And so Sarah is with us tonight, and she's asking whether burnt offerings were the only kind of offering. And they're not. Your manual for the priest begins with the different types of offerings. And so we're going to discuss them and tie them in and look at them this evening. And so, as I said, Sarah is the one with us. I've really been able to find some of these. They were sort of lost and pull them back in. And so Sarah could be there with her cup of coffee. Now, we do have to finish, because this is an exegetical study, the end of the burnt offering instructions, because I would feel bad if I did not let you hear about the instructions for a burnt offering with birds, particularly because there is a tie-in that will be interesting to investigate with a previous scripture. So I am placing this up here. We have not gotten into the other sacrifices, but in an exegetical study, you move from pericope to pericope. This was originally done as a Sunday school, and so we're going to discuss this last part of burnt offering and move into the other offerings tonight. That's a little different than apologetics, because in apologetics, you begin with a question, and then you look at the biblical data and the related data to see what's going on. But in an exegetical study, you have to move. Now, my Glendale, who was on a previous show, would even go less than pericope by pericope. He would move verse by verse. Shout out to Built for Speed. Good to have him there. Let's look at this section by having me share the PowerPoint with you. Now, the verses are in the PowerPoint, and so we can see them directly, and I think they'll show up fairly well. There you go. Again, I'm putting less verses on so that you can see them better, but this means that the pericope has to be spread over more sections, and that'll be true of Bible verses even when I use an apologetics. If I limit the number of lines on the slide, then I need more slides to cover the section of scripture that I'm referring to. But this could be a good thing. And if the burnt sacrifice of his offering to the Lord is of birds, he shall bring the offering of turtle doves or young pigeons. The priest shall bring it to the altar, wring off its head, burn it on the altar, and the blood shall be drained at the side of the altar. I know that that doesn't sound real appetizing. So if you guys are doing a donut or something, kind of hang in there with me. Maybe you might want to put the donut down or the other food down while we describe this stuff, because it is a little difficult to take. What's different here, and I'm going to leave the PowerPoint up, is that you have birds treated differently. Now, the two birds mentioned here are turtle doves and young pigeons. You would not offer an unclean bird. You need to remove its neck, burn it on the altar, and the blood, of course, is drained on the side of the altar. Now, we are not going to be doing that in this day and age, for a lot of very good reasons. But what can we gather from this? Well, interestingly enough, as we go through this, we're going to see a tie-in to previous sacrifices. You have to remove the crop of feathers and place it by the altar. I know that sounds a little funny. Some things do not burn well. Okay. Now, Cox is letting me know that for some bizarre reason, my connection is going in and out. So I trust that I'm coming in okay. But I do not know what's going on here. I am in a very powerful router, but it seems that Cox is having a little trouble this evening, and we'll just work with it. You cast them by the altar in the place of ashes. You split its wings, but you shall not divide it completely. Now, this is going to be interesting because we're going to see this sort of sacrifice appear somewhere else, but you don't completely divide the bird. In the case of the sacrifice we're going to look at, it's a little different, but it's interesting. The priest burns it on the altar. Now, it's got to be completely consumed. It's a burnt offering made by fire. Thank you for the sound check there, Samuel. That's real helpful. And it's called a sweet aroma to the Lord. Now, why this is particularly useful is that those Jewish polemicists that would like to say that sacrifice was not good, something God never wanted, can not possibly do so in the face of this being considered a sweet aroma to the Lord. Beyond that, those who would like to say that sacrifice was not something God designed for other reasons or mock it would also have to deal with that verse. Now, what's interesting is this sort of thing happens earlier, and we're going to talk about, well, what is the relationship and how do we understand the relationship between Abraham doing this in Genesis 15, 7 through 10, because Abraham doing this is pre-Sinai. Okay, it's before the law was given. The instructions for the priest are given at about the time the law is received at Sinai. They may have been compiled as to where they fit and how things were arranged, but those instructions were given. The priests needed to follow them. But Abraham is previous to this, so let's look at the instructions here. You see that you split it at the wings, but you don't divide it in Leviticus. He said to him, I am the Lord God who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees, which is in the area of the Arabian Peninsula, to give you this land to inherit it. And he said, Lord God, how do I know that I will inherit it? So Abraham's issue is he has no male heirs. So how will he inherit and pass on the land to his descendants after him, his seed, if he has no inheritors at all? And the issue would be that in the ancient world, it is very likely, and as I understand things, Eliezer of Damascus, his steward, would inherit. Sounds a little weird, but property went through the man, which, by the way, is also an indication to me that Jewishness at least goes through the father, because it would make no sense to have a disenfranchised Jewish individuals with no land, because tribal succession also went through the male. Another little thing where I think the rabbis are, again, dead wrong and are not paying attention to other parts of Torah to inherit it. He said, Lord God, how do I know I'll inherit it? So Abraham is very concerned. God gives him some instructions here. Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Now look at those last two. They're the very birds that would be used in a burnt offering as it pertains to birds. And he brought these and he cut them down the middle. Now you're thinking he cut all of them down the middle. Well, the instructions are very interesting. He did not cut the birds in two. So the instructions for Abraham's sacrifice, which is going to totally be kind of consumed, are the same general instructions related to dealing with birds. So that will leave us with an interesting question, because where did Abraham get these instructions? Well, they got them from God, but does that mean that Abraham was following the law prior to the law being given? Rabbis will end up saying that there was a hidden oral law that Abraham followed that became the Talmud, and it becomes their basis for pushing the Talmud and the rabbinical authority on Jewish people, essentially the rabbinical writings, which represent that rabbinical authority. So what they'd argue is Abraham knew the law before Moses gave it. He knew it because there was an oral law that was understood, that was passed down, that eventually was given in its entirety to Moses along with the written law. And now I approve for the Talmud. See, I've just proven the oral law and its necessity and the fact that there has to be an oral law. And so Sarah is asking exactly the right question because Jewish people are exposed to this sort of argument. Let's look at what an answer would be. And I say absolutely not. There is sufficient evidence against any sort of oral law. We're not going to look at it in this episode, but there is sufficient evidence against any sort of law. And that evidence indicates that it is not as though Abraham was receiving an oral law and following Torah, which is what the rabbis would say, prior to the receiving of the law at Sinai. What is happening is God is codifying something related to the system of sacrifice that Abraham was using for Israel. In other words, this is the way it was done. This is the instructions God gave, and then he made them for all Israel, binding at Sinai. So what Father Abraham did became the pattern for the children of Israel in relationship to dealing with sacrifices with birds. Now, we've had all three types of animals, and this pattern is repeated with each of the offerings except the grain offering, in terms of bullocks and goats and birds. Now, what's going on here? The children of Israel sacrificed, but they didn't always sacrifice the same thing. And it very much could have related to what they had on hand that was allowable as a sacrifice. The pigeon and the turtle dove were easier to get, and they end up getting used by the poor and basically are the poor man's sacrifice. You could not afford a goat or a bull if you were from a poor family. Now, where does that help us? That helps us with what Mary offers. She does not offer a bull or a goat. She offers the turtle doves, which were used by those who didn't have money to give something as expensive as a bullock or a goat, or did not have the money to purchase it at the temple. That's not true here, but later on, you purchased your animals at the temple predominantly because Roman money had the picture of the emperor on it, and you could not pay for a sacrifice with the picture of the emperor. It was considered uncool. And so you would have to exchange your money for Israeli money, shekels, Israeli money, and then you would buy your animal. And the reason you also didn't take the animal with you is that you were pilgrimaging up to Jerusalem. The animal and its need for food and the extra work involved made it easier to just convert the animal or whatever to money and then purchase an animal at the temple. This is going to lead to problems with extortion later on. But what God is codifying, yes, Samuel asked the question. Yes, they were saying essentially that this oral law, which is connected to Torah, that Abraham was essentially following Torah. But they do it through saying that Abraham was following Torah in terms of the idea that whether he was following written Torah or not, he was following oral Torah. Remember that the term Torah is used both ways. But that's exactly what they're saying. They're saying Abraham was following the law before the law was given. God codified things that were going on before in the law. And that would make perfect sense, especially around the sacrificial system, because we know that Noah sacrificed and Abraham sacrificed. And yes, Cain and Abel had a dispute related to being accepted by God based on sacrifice. When we see sacrifice begin is after the fall, which also tells me something about the idea that sacrifice is necessary in terms of vicarious atonement, because of when it appears. That just further emphasizes the point. So now we're going to talk about a different sort of thing. We're going to talk about the grain offering. Now, each of these offerings had different purposes. And we didn't spend a lot of time on the burnt offering and its purpose, but it had to do with total surrender to God. We're going to see the sin offering has its purposes. It may be in terms of seeking, in terms of desiring to experience or making oneself right in an area of wrongness, or it may have just been for other reasons. But the grain offering or the mincha comes from the word that means a gift. They were in terms of expressing reverence or homage, gratitude, or allegiance. And Christopher Wright points this out in his commentary on Leviticus in the New Bible Commentary. You'll see verses there. Okay. And the grain offering simply is the Hebrew word mincha. And so you see the references to it where this word appears in terms of an offering being given. Let's look at an incident with a grain offering. I'm going to Judges 6. Gideon went and prepared a young goat and unleavened bread from an ephod of flour. Now, the meat is not the grain offering, but the unleavened bread from an ephod of flour is. The meat he put in a basket, and he put broth in the pot and brought it out to him under the terebinth tree and presented them. Now, who is he presenting them to? The angel of the Lord. He better be presenting them to God. He does not go through a priest. He brings these gifts directly to the angel of the Lord. More evidence for the deity of the angel of the Lord, by the way. Take the meat and unleavened flour and lay them on this rock. And so he does. And the angel of the Lord put out the end of his staff from his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened bread. And fire rose from the rock and consumed the meat and unleavened bread. Now, in the case of the unleavened bread, what we're discussing here is a grain offering. Now, immediately, Gideon understands some things from this. He perceived he was the angel of the Lord. Now, that wouldn't be a big deal if he was just your average, ordinary angel. But alas, look at what Gideon says. Alas, O Lord God, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. And he's terrified because seeing the angel of the Lord face to face was seeing God face to face. Now, the angel of the Lord talks and communicates, and we've talked about all this. This is a theophany. This is not an anthropomorphism. The anthropomorphism, if you understand the angel of the Lord as God, well, that doesn't, we're talking about a theophany. We'll just leave it at that. What's interesting is what happened in Jewish worship. And this is sort of where the price of admission kind of falls in. If you want to understand what happened with Jewish worship and how the word mincha is used nowadays, you can get a feel for that. That is the afternoon service. So you have Shachrit, you have Mincha, and you have Mariv. And a Jewish person who is observant, who goes to synagogue 3 times a day, will have these services as well as their own personal prayers. So when you rise in the morning, you very likely will recite the Shabbat. You will wash your hands and say the blessing. You will indeed have introductory prayers. So Jews do say the Shema outside of the synagogue in their own homes. And then you will go to synagogue for the early service, which is called Shachrit, which is the Hebrew word for dawn. Now, the afternoon service, late afternoon service, is called Mincha, the exact same name for a grain offering or a gift. And then Mariv is from Erev, which means evening. So Jewish people who are observant, who pray through the Siddur, observantly will pray through the Siddur 3 times a day. Shout out to Lindsay. It is so good to have you here. Now, why did this happen? And this is so interesting. And I want to go to Daniel. So I'm going to try to go ahead and go to Daniel to tie this in for you as to what Daniel was doing. All right. Jewish people did not have the sacrificial system. under the covenant made at the time of the temple when God appeared to Solomon, when Jewish people were in exile during the period of time of the Babylonian captivity, when Solomon's temple is destroyed, they're allowed to pray towards that temple because Solomon had an agreement or an acceptance from God that if the Jewish people prayed towards this place, his temple, God would hear from heaven and have regard for their prayers. That is not true for Herod's temple. Herod was no Solomon. So that is not true towards Herod's temple. So let me take you to what Daniel is doing and show you what Daniel is doing, because Daniel does something in Daniel that we often overlook but is real important. So I'm pulling this up and I'm going to Daniel. And Daniel's going to get in trouble for his prayer life. All right. And I believe it's Daniel 5. Okay, Daniel 3. There we go. Okay, the king is tricked into the king isn't tricked. The king decides that given this great vision that Daniel has had of these kingdoms, in which he is prominent, talk about pride, that they will bow down and worship the image. He makes an image based on the dream he has, which talks about the succession of kingdoms. And he says everyone has to bow down and worship it. And of course, that does not happen. There are 3 that basically don't do that. Okay. And I'm moving through here. These 3 are spared. Now, Daniel's going to run into trouble because there's some people that want to get rid of him. Okay. So Nebuchadnezzar deals with Daniel, and I got to give myself a chance here. This is not coming up right. Okay. This is searching by head keyword. I'm going to go to 6. Okay, here we go. There we go. Okay, Darius comes on the scene, and Darius unwillingly is tricked because under the law of the Persians and Medes, even a king cannot change the law. Now, under Nebuchadnezzar, which was Babylon, a king ruled over the law. So it was Rex Lex, the king over the law. But when the Persians and Medes, the Medo come in, Darius, it is Lex Rex, the king over the law. Difference between the 2 kingdoms. Now, they figure out that the only way they can get rid of Daniel is to make him sin in regards to his God. Now, why am I doing all this? Because there's something signed that no one can pray to anyone but the king for a period of time. What does Daniel do? Now, when Daniel knew, and I'm going to go here and bring this back up here, add to the stream, and I'm going to make this larger because I can see it, but you cannot. There it is, 200. Okay. When Daniel knew, that is not what I asked for. There we go. When Daniel knew, and it's about as big as I can make it, the writing was signed. He went into his upper room. Okay. Now watch what happens here. He knelt down on his knees 3 times a day. See the 3 times a day? Why 3 times a day? Because it was correlated to the time of the offerings at the temple. This is where the custom of praying 3 times a day begins for the Jewish people. This is where they begin to actually do this. And so they already, Daniel kind of starts this custom or this thing of doing it. Remember, if you pray towards this place, Solomon's agreement with God, God will pay attention. So Daniel took the exact times when the offerings were, and he prayed towards the temple so that it would be regarded. And so that's what he ends up doing. This is a temporary agreement. We do not see this agreement renewed, because I've heard that argument too. It was okay for Daniel not to need blood sacrifices. Daniel was in a unique position that is not renewed in reference to Solomon's temple, which is found in Chronicles. But I'm not going to take you there. This is what he's doing. Okay? It was his custom since earliest days, because he's in the captivity, and so he's paying attention to the normal time of the sacrifices. And Mincha came from that grain offering and was connected. And so that's what we're dealing with there. That now explains why Daniel does what he does. He is being perfectly scriptural. He is honoring the agreement that Solomon had with God that is referenced in Chronicles, where God accepts Solomon's prayer that when anyone prays towards his temple, which was the one that was destroyed, this temple, that it would be regarded, and that God would eventually return them to the land. And eventually he does, because there's post-exilic return. Now, here's what it doesn't do for us. Okay, because then some Jewish people will say, well, same deal here. Jews began to regard, okay, I'm going to go here to simply, Jews began to regard praying about the sacrifices as being equivalent to having the sacrificial system. That's a stopgap measure added to other measures when the temple was destroyed, so that they could keep a non-Jesus honoring Judaism going, or essentially create what became rabbinical Judaism. So this is the parting of the ways. And in order to fill in for the temple system, so they would not have to acknowledge that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, they ended up doing this. Okay? And so Jews will say that, well, praying the sacrifices is like doing them. Well, in the case of Daniel, praying the sacrifices wasn't like doing them. Praying during the time of the sacrifices got honored because of the covenant or arrangement that God had with Solomon pertaining to his temple. I hope that clarifies some things and makes some things work for you. Here's the grain offering text as to what was required. How do you do this? And then we'll talk about the grain offering and, in relation to vicarious atonement. If anyone offers a grain offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour. You know how we sift flour? That sort of flour. He shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. He shall bring it to Aaron's sons as priests, one of whom shall take from it his handful of flour and oil with all the frankincense, and the priest shall burn it as a memorial on the altar, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. The rest of the grain offering shall be Aaron and his sons. Now, that's distinctly different than the sin offering. Under the sin offering, the priest did not get a portion. Under the grain offering, they do get a portion. So that's already different. I know this is a little small, because I had to cover 8 verses, and they're very compact verses. Okay. This is the section here, but it goes further. What do we do with this? As a memorial, sweet aroma, the rest is the sons. It shall be most holy, made by fire. You shall bring an offering of grain baked in an oven, and it shall be unleavened cakes. Very important, unleavened cakes. Now, let me draw some messianic significance for you. Jesus was unleavened without sin. Leaven represents sin. Unleavened bread is used during Passover. Jesus was unleavened. He is the unleavened one. When an offering was offered before God that was this type of offering, it needed to be unleavened. Fine flour mixed with oil of unleavened wafers anointed with oil. You used a frying pan. Think of this almost as like pancakes. Okay, so you have your grain offering that's thrown on the altar, flash burn here, and then you've got your cakes that are made. And it shall be made with fine flour. You shall bring the grain offering made with these things to the Lord. It shall be presented to the priest. He shall bring it to the altar. So you did not have contact with the altar in this case either. But rather, these cakes were used unleavened by frankincense. Interestingly enough, where do we see frankincense? Well, it's one of the things brought to Jesus. Not in terms of him directly, but remember the wise men or man. We really do not know how many there were. It is assumed 3 wise men because there were 3 gifts. The assumption is each wise man brought a gift, but the biblical text is silent as to the number. Okay. And that's just a repeat of the same slide, a little bigger. Okay. And more instruction. Look how detailed we get with all of this. It had to be done a certain way. Okay. Interestingly enough, I want you to look at that word memorial portion there. Okay. And I'm going to read it from mine so I can see the nikud better because I like seeing the vowel pointings. But you'll see azhara from the word zachar, which means to remember. So the word memorial is not a separate word in Hebrew, but it's actually connected to a form of the word having the idea to remember. And so this is a memorial portion. It's not all burned. This is how Aaron and his sons ate. Remember that they were given no portion in the land when they get there. They're given some access, but they don't have their own farming territories. They're to live on the offerings of their brothers and the sacrificial system. So the sacrificial system not only provided an instrument for God to dwell among his people, but it provided an instrument for those who were charged with the ministry of the tabernacle full time and continuously to be able to have food and to be able to have sustenance. Now, that is probably something the church absorbed, and it became the idea of full-time clergy. We see that idea with the elders being freed up to pray and the word and the formation of the deacons. But where did the early church, remember, we got a bunch of Jewish folks sitting around, get this sort of idea? Well, they get this sort of idea, and I'm going to put me back on. They get this sort of idea because there was precedent. The Old Testament set precedents that showed them principles that they could use in dealing with this. And then the qualifications for elder are given through Paul, who receives that revelation. In other words, he receives information about how the church is to run. Remember, he says he's a steward of this present dispensation. I didn't come up with the word dispensation. Paul does. It's house rules. It's actually a Greek word. And so here's what we have. And so Aaron and his sons, or the priests, live off the offerings. Now, again, this is picked on by Jewish people as a means of skirting blood atonement or vicarious atonement by the idea, and Singer will use this, grain doesn't bleed. That's okay, because it's placed on the altar where the blood is already there. So in the case of the grain offering, the blood is provided by previous offerings. It is not God getting rid of the need for blood atonement, not in any way. It is God having an offering where the blood is provided from previous offerings. This is something pointed out by Dr. Michael Brown. Well, then we have the peace offering. Whoops. Okay. Now, this is a different offering. Okay. And you have the Hebrew up there. The first word is and if, ve'im. Then we have the word for essentially offering. Okay. Zavach. Now, what's interesting is that last word for the peace offering. The last word for the peace offering comes from the Hebrew word shalom. In fact, it's a plural of that. word. It's a male plural. Sorry about that, gals. Shalomim. Now, what does the word shalom mean? This is such a rich Hebrew word. I think the church should still make use of giving each other the peace, not as a legalistic requirement, but I always feel that when going churches and it's like greeting time, hi, how you doing? The church was concerned with wishing each other something, desiring good for each other. The word shalom doesn't simply mean a cessation of violence, but it actually is the idea of wholeness. So when I say shalom to someone, what I'm wishing them is wholeness. Welfare and peace come in relationship to wholeness. The more whole, the more we are completely the image bearers that we are supposed to be, the more we will experience peace and welfare. In other words, as C.S. Lewis said, and I wrote this quote recently, to step out of God's will is to step into nothing. Okay. The precise meaning of the name is related to shalom. There's some questions about how we're to understand that sort of nounal form in its plural like that. The purpose was to establish good relations between the worshiper and God. That's kind of interesting in itself. So that is the purpose of this offering. The division in the text, again, we always start with the cattle, we move to the sheep and goats, but there are no directions for a bird sacrifice for this offering. None. Do I know exactly why? No, I don't. I do not know exactly why. There are no instructions related to a bird offering. For some reason, God has decided in his infinite wisdom when he set this system up to disallow. Oh, excellent question. I'm going to take that. Samuel asked, does shalom also represent a kind of restoration? In the sense that if you were not whole and you became whole, yes, could very well mean that. Hebrews were not concerned with existence, non-existence. They were far more concerned with certain other things. They understood that the order of things needed to be right, and I needed to be in line with that order. And so I can honestly say that, yes, it does. Paul wishes the believers peace and grace, peace unto you and grace from our Lord Jesus Christ. He does this in several letters. Okay? Now, while the Greek word is used, the Hebrew meaning is infused into that Greek word. Understand that the disciples and early writers of your New Testament were writing Greek with Hebrew understandings attached. Okay? That's a very important thing to understand. They were not writing Greek strictly within the terms in which Greek had been used. It had been infused with Hebrew meanings, because remember that Old Testament acts as the foundation. And so the ultimate desire of God is the restoration of wholeness, things being what they were meant to be, right relationship between his creation and him. And so Paul often wished believers that. Some churches still wish each other the peace. Some of the greetings that the ancient church used, I think, are still very valuable for us. Not just to force the liturgy on you and be all legalistic or something horrible. But during Easter, the idea of greeting each other with Christ is risen indeed, is really a neat idea. And the idea of wishing people peace, wholeness, and grace, God's favor, is a wonderful sort of thing. Same division as usual. No birds are involved in the making of this offering. Okay. What were the reasons for wanting to have this peace, this peaceful relationship between God and man? Why would we do this? What was it used for? And it looks like Cox is doing its thing. I hope it does its thing correctly. Every so often. It is what it is. There are reasons this covenant was used. And so if you're having some stability problems, you can still look at the slide. The making or renewal of a covenant could include a peace offering, wholeness between God and man. Examples of that are Exodus 24:5 and Deuteronomy 27:7. The appointing of a king, the dedicating of the temple. Now let's go there, because I talked about this agreement with Solomon, and so God exegetically has allowed me to go to the location that I had spoken of previously. So I'm going to go here first. It's 1 Kings 8:63. Then I'm going to go here, and I'm going to put in 1 Kings 8:63. I cannot go above 200 magnification. There we are. Okay, and what you'll see here, and I'll highlight it for you, is that Solomon offered a sacrifice of peace offerings. And so that's why that's there. Now, the question is whether his agreement, here we go. And while in Chronicles that agreement is stated, it is not repeated here. So it does not give me the same opportunity as going to Chronicles, but it does allow me to discuss the peace offering. Sometimes what Logos will actually do, which is really nice when they do it, is they will actually give you the cross-reference here. But they don't seem to do that, because sometimes, oh, here we go. Here it is. It is there. Excellent. It's just previous. So the cross-reference sort of does work. Okay. There we go. Whenever prayer or supplication is made by anyone or all your people Israel, for each one knows the plague of his own heart, he spreads out his hands towards this temple, which is exactly what Daniel was doing. Then hear from heaven your dwelling place, forgive and act, and give everyone according to what his heart you know, for you alone know the hearts of men. Then he goes into the foreigner. Okay, this is interesting because this is a missionary prayer. Okay. Now, when they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin. Notice that comment there. And you become angry with them and deliver them to their enemy. Here we go. And take them captive to their enemy, near or far. There you go. Yet when they come to themselves, where they're carried, and repent and make supplication. Okay. And it goes on to say, you know, that we have sinned. It gives them the wording of the confession here. Okay. Whenever they return to you in soul, you lead them away, and they pray to you towards this land you gave, towards the city you've chosen, and towards the temple I have built. Notice this is an agreement with Solomon. I have built. 48. And I'm going to go to 48 with the Hebrew and see. Now, the Masoretic text doesn't always line up. Okay. And so it doesn't line up perfectly. But what I wanted was the I have built. There it is. Which I have built. Let me get the Hebrew. It's not going to be perfect. It's the second word there. Okay. To. And the word temple should be there. Okay, which I have chosen, and the house. I'm just going to go right to the Hebrew. and see the actual text because it's just easier. It has the lemma, but it's not giving me. Okay, for your name. I have built for your name. Okay, for your or to your name. I have built. So it is there. Then hear from heaven your dwelling place their prayer and supplication, and maintain your cause and forgive your people who have sinned against you. That's where I'm really actually going. So that's the Solomonic agreement there that Daniel's doing. And you see that peace offerings were offered at the time of that. Anyway, let's go back to where we were. And I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint here. Okay. Those are the occasions. Renewal of covenant. Also, you're going to see peace offerings. I have to go 2 verses in. See, we start here. Keep the commandments this day. Then you set up the stones. When you've crossed, you enter into the land the Lord your God's giving, a land just as was promised. Okay. Therefore it be when you've crossed over, you shall build the whole stones into an altar, offer peace offerings. But what other offerings shall you offer? Well, you shall offer burnt offerings, but you shall also offer peace offerings. The covenant's being renewed. The reiteration goes back to the previous covenant at Sinai. The renewal is because they're going to be entering the land. And of course, there you go. Sacrifices of peace offerings in relation to the installation of a king. Sol the king before the Lord. And then they offer peace offerings. So we see that there too, in line with that verse. Okay, we've jumped there. Okay. Just further emphasis on the same thing. Personal reasons. There are personal reasons, not just public reasons. We dealt with the public reasons. There are personal reasons. This is the law of the sacrifice of peace offerings, which you shall offer to the Lord. If he offers it for a thanksgiving, he shall offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving. So that would be a personal reason for going ahead and doing this. Okay. And of course, you have the instructions being given, particularly if this was a personal offering and its relationship to Thanksgiving. Now, I think that we're going to deal briefly here with the text for cattle. I don't want to reiterate, some of these things are exactly the same. There's still a laying on of hands on that animal, which represents your identification with the animal, but now the identification is slightly different. This is what I'm giving. I identify, but not necessarily in terms of the animal quite the same way. It's the same procedure, but it's a different offering. Still made by fire. We still have the fat being removed and the kidneys being removed. I know you're looking at this and going, yay, this is like all detailed procedure. And it is detailed. It is much the same. There's a lot of overlap here. It too is a sweet aroma, God desiring it. Well, that's as far as we're going to get. We're not going to get to the goats. We're not going to get to the birds. The birds are going to be left out. So you can see some of the interesting implications of this. First of all, the idea of right relationship between man and God allows for fullness or wholeness. And it allows human beings to be what they're supposed to be. the greeting that the church has used and that Paul used goes back to this idea of wholeness. We see also the idea of the temple being the praying towards the temple was only a temporary provision, not a permanent provision. So Jews can't use that today. We see that the reading of the offerings or praying at the time of the offerings, as Daniel did, fit in with that provision with Solomon, but it did not remove the need for blood atonement. It was a temporary provision. We saw that in Kings. It's also in Chronicles. It's stated a little differently. And we saw the end of the burnt offering. And what we see there is God later codifies things that were done before for Israel. But that doesn't infer that the Torah was given. Doesn't mean the Torah was previously given or there was a secret oral law. It's just God codifying things previously for his nation, for the nation that's going to be his theocracy. I'm going to throw up this comment. I really liked it. But yes, and that's great. I'm so glad that you got that. So that is really good. I'm glad you put that together and you've been blessed by it. And we see that just because commands were followed previously does not mean that the Torah at Sinai had been given previously. You will see things like that with Noah and clean and unclean animals. Noah had access to God and could have had revelation. The writer is noting something about Noah's sacrifices, but it does not mean that Noah practiced Torah in the sense of the full Torah given at Sinai. And so we don't want to make that mistake. But that is the sort of thinking. I remember learning that in Hebrew school, that Abraham followed Torah. Muslims will do that with Abraham following Allah, so he was a Muslim. That sort of reading back does not work. So that is where we're at. I'm so glad that a bunch of you ended up making it. I don't know if there's anything else that has come up in relation to any of this, or even not in relation to any of it. I do notice that we're continuing to have little scattered things with the Wi-Fi. So a little bit of update. Next week, I am planning broadcasts, but the week after, I will be getting ready to go to Vermont. We will be leaving at 6 in the morning, which means I need to pack all my computer stuff the night before. I am thinking that given the earliness of the morning hours with getting up to be at the airport on a bit of a red eye, that the week after this week, and be checking. I'm going to show you where to check, okay, to find out more. Okay, if you ever want to know what's going on here. Oh, I'm going to get back to that question in a minute. Samuel asked another question. Okay. But I'm going to go ahead and put this up. This is a place where you can get information about broadcasts. Okay. And I will try to keep you posted. In fact, I think I have the banner, but I'll put this in here. Okay, you can go there to go ahead and get information. Or the other place you can get information is at Patreon. Okay. But if you're not a patron, you're going to have trouble getting information there. So, question, are Shabbat and Salem connected? Not directly, indirectly. You'll notice the consonants are different. Where the consonants are different, there's a different idea. So, Shabbat is Shin or Shin Beit Tav. But Shalom is Shin, Sin, Lamed, Mem. And I'm saying that because of the way it's dotted. The Sin and the Shin are dotted differently. And so not directly, indirectly, they believe that there's probably some common tie, but not directly. So that's the way I would answer that question. Great question, Samuel. Thank you. It is probably the tie-in between the seventh and God resting on the seventh day. The word for Shabbat means to cease. And the seventh day God ceased. So there's probably a play on words there with the word ceased. And I'm going to get rid of that banner, which is still hanging out there. And I didn't see that. There you go. That's up there. So that's the answer to that question. And I think we're just about there. So there are times I love it when we go over. There are times when we go over. But when things wrap up pretty much in about an hour, I kind of let them. Shout out to everyone who was here. We'll see how this video does. Some of them have done better than others, but I am thrilled to be here and give you this material. As I always said, we're small, but we're mighty. So with that, I'm going to move on to say Erev Tov, or good evening, because that's what it is about here. It's probably good night where you are. And thank you, Samuel. I'm so grateful for all of you. So I'm going to say Erev Tov. Oh, look at that. No, we got to put that up because we've been talking about Shalom. There you go. That is Shalom with the vowel pointings. Yes, we got the vowel pointings in. That is a cute trick to get the Nakud in on a English computer with a Hebrew keyboard that you can bring up in Microsoft. So there it is. And your main part of the word there is that first, that second letter, and the third. That vav there actually is treated as a vowel. So thank you, Slam, for that. And I'm going to wave Erev Tov. And I will see you again soon.